Hey, Alientude here, and as some of you may know, I was recently at my first Combat Con. If you're not familiar, Combat Con is held annually in Las Vegas, and it's a celebration of combat arts, with a particular focus on HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts. They're sponsored by a boatload of vendors, many of which set up booths to browse their wares, and they have a variety of instructor-led classes in martial arts. In addition, there's quite a few tournaments, ranging from sword and buckler, to tatami cutting, to longsword, to pub-style stick fighting, and even a whole host of lightsaber events. I wasn't able to attend any of the classes due to my elbow injury, but it was still a lot of fun browsing the vendors' booths, watching tournaments, and meeting other people as enthusiastic about swords as I am. So speaking of those booths, there were two in particular I was specifically interested in visiting, and they're where I spent the majority of my booth time: Albion Swords and Sterling Armory. Albion's booth was seriously impressive. They had around 30 swords and a few axes on display, and it was one superb sword after another. I've tried to identify all of them here. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. I got a chance to handle just about all of these, and it was a treat. If you haven't had a chance to handle an Albion, I highly recommend trying to visit one of their in-person booths, whether that's at Combat Con or someplace else. Even if you're not really in the market for an Albion, it's worth it to experience their amazing swords. Before Combat Con, I sold some swords and saved some money to help fund a purchase or two. I spent quite a bit of time at Albion's booth trying to decide between the Landgraf and the Steward. Eventually I decided on the Steward, with one of the reasons being that a Type 13A sword is much more forgiving than a Type 17 for a cutting novice such as myself. The Albion rep behind the booth was Mike, and he was a lot of fun to speak with. He mentioned that he brought two Warwicks, Albion's new Model 16A, and the first two people to visit the booth bought one. They went quick, obviously. Albion does have several more models based on this blade coming soon, and further, 3 to 4 new models entirely coming in the next year or two. Exciting times. The other booth I was really interested in visiting was Sterling Armory's. I'd seen Sterling post some great looking swords on Facebook in the weeks leading up to Combat Con, and I was really curious if they were as nice in person as they looked online. I asked around on the SBG forums, and not many people had much experience with them. Well, I'm happy to say that the swords are excellent in person. Sterling Armory is a bit unique in that the primary owner, Chris Fields, makes most of the blades and also completes some swords with hilt work, but they also have a couple of other people that take those blades and do their own cutlery to finish them. This can lead to a very different style. Josh, for instance, enjoys creating swords with some fantasy flair to them and a worn, used look, whereas Chris goes for the crisp and clean fit and finish. One constant between all of these swords is that they all feel great in the hand. It's hard to put into words just how well balanced, agile, and joyful these swords were to wield. Now, as much as I enjoyed handling all of them, and I really do love the one I bought, I do have to issue one word of warning. Sterling Armory contracts out their heat treat to, I believe it's Braddock Metallurgical. I might have got that name wrong. In the words of Chris, they're great at hitting the target HRC, the hardness of the blade, but not so great at preventing warps. Looking down the blades, I did notice minor warps in several of them. They weren't huge, and I don't think they would affect performance. However, they are warps, and that might turn some people off. Chris said the warps happen much less often in the shorter blades, so if you're not able to see one of these in person, probably go for a shorter blade than a longer one. There were a good number of other vendor booths, but I didn't do a very good job of getting photos or video of them. I admit to being blinded by Albion and Sterling Armory. Here's what little I did get of Windrose Armoury's impressive armor collection. I'll try to do better next year. So other than browsing some pretty epic vendor booths, the majority of time I spent at Combat Con was watching the various tournaments. There were some pretty great prizes awarded, including an Albion Warwick for the winner of the cutting competition. Now, I wasn't able to get any footage of the finals for any of the tournaments, but I'll include a link to Combat Con's live stream of the finals in the description. Here's some footage of the early rounds of the cutting competition. Next up is some video of a variety of HEMA tournaments. As somebody who has only just started taking HEMA classes, this was pretty fascinating to watch. I especially enjoyed the longsword fights. Lastly, the Armored Tournament. This was an experimental event. It's only the second time Combat Con has done it, the previous time being around 9 years ago. The referee here is the winner of that first tournament. This was a pretty fascinating event, and I'll talk about my observation while it plays. First off, the basic rules as I understand them. There were only a few ways to score points: thrusts to unarmored areas, disarms, or sustained thrusts to mail. Throws were not allowed, but the contestants still went for them fairly often, probably because it's a very common technique in armored fighting. The variety in the harnesses was interesting, ranging from nearly full articulated plate to a relatively lightly armored individual. You could immediately tell he was more nimble than the other fighters due to the lighter harness, but he was also much more vulnerable. There were a lot of unarmored areas for his opponents to strike. Leather straps broke quite often during this contest. At one point, a spectator pulled his belt off to help repair a greave. From what I gathered, much of the armor was on loan to the fighters from various vendors, which makes sense. Quite a bit of it seemed a little ill-fitting to me. A properly fitted harness would probably protect the fighter better, have less failures, and overall work better. It's also very expensive, though. Alright, that's going to wrap up my Combat Con video. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and if so, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. I'll be returning to my reviews after this, so look for the next one in 2 weeks. Until then, Alien Toot out.